I'm Henry McCabe. I was born September the 3rd, 1922, in a three-room house alongside a railroad in Cleveland, Oklahoma. My father was a mechanical engineer on a railroad in Osage, Oklahoma, and not a conventional engineer, but one who was a mechanic on steam engines and worked inside of a roundhouse. This roundhouse would bring in engines and they would turn it around so employees could work on the engine. I moved from Cleveland to Osage in my first year of birth in 1922, so we moved over there during that year. My father was married to Pearl McCabe. Her maiden name is Pearl Pierce. They moved from Arkansas in a covered wagon with their mother and dad's. They had horses and they had their cows and chickens with them, and they moved to Oklahoma in 1921. My father worked before he came to Cleveland as an underground miner in Miami, Oklahoma, which was a coal mining town and also a lead and zinc mining town. So they moved down there, and I was born and raised there in Osage all of my life until 1942. You'll be of interest what's happened to me recently. I'm, as of September the 3rd, I'm 96 years old, and I met a young lady who was 84 at a retirement center, and we got married 8 months ago. And we're looking forward to living life to its fullest, making travels and getting acquainted with people. Now, after I entered grade school, I was a small person, and even though I was just turned 6 years old, they let me start to school. And when I was 6 years old, which that would make it 1928, and I was there until I graduated in 1940. As I was coming up as a child, I was always interested in doing things and working and selling and doing stuff rather than sports. So I sold, when I was about 6 or 8 years old, I sold some salve called cloverine salve, door to door, and bought the salve for 20 cents and sold it for 35, something like that. And I sold a lot of salve. Actually, I had more pocket change and money in my pocket than my uncles, who were all unemployed at the time. Also, I sold a newspaper called Grit about that time, which is still being published. More recently, I got an invitation from them to renew my subscription, and I hadn't heard from them for years. But anyhow, after that, I became I signed shoes at a barber shop on weekends, and during the week, later as I got somewhat older, I delivered newspapers. I had a newspaper route and had about 125 customers, and also mowed lawns and washed windows and did all of that. Later, I became a fry cook and worked at a local restaurant there in Osage as a fry cook, and I learned how to do that. When I was about 16 years old, I would catch a train from Osage down to Sand Springs, Oklahoma, and they had an interurban rail line from Sand Springs into downtown Tulsa. Cost you 10 cents, and I'd ride that down and get off at Union Station. I had an uncle who worked in Tulsa for Sun Oil Company, and he let me stay with them. And for 2 years in a row, I worked as a fry cook at a string of small restaurants in downtown Tulsa called the Golden Goose. And I learned that business side of it. Prior to that, being a dishwasher there in Osage for a small restaurant, this man saw some potential in me, and he said, Henry said, once you get out of school, once you and I get together and we'll go to Sand Springs and we'll get a rail car and we'll put in a hamburger stand. That's the first business deal I didn't get into. Okay, but nevertheless, I did learn somewhat of the business, and then I got out of high school. I went to OSU University briefly, and thereafter I went to a trade school here in Tulsa. The trade school was involved in training different employees on how to make parts for an airplane here in Tulsa that was being manufactured by Spartan Aircraft. It was a Stearman airplane, biplane, and was purchased by the Navy as a training plane for the Navy pilots. I went to work there in about 1941 as what they call a production expediter, and the expediter would come to work, and if there was a certain part missing on that plane that was not qualified to be approved to be sold to the Navy, you'd find that particular part, our parts, and in the plant someplace, and expedite it through all the process so that you could get that plane released to the Navy. So I got my early training there. While I was in the trade school, I learned how to make aircraft wing parts in plywood. I also studied some engineering drawings and they showed us how to read blueprints, also how to trace electrical diagrams and hydraulic diagrams. So it was a big training thing for me. So I worked here at Spartan, and when I came along for my first review, the young guy that I worked for was my manager. I was up for a raise. I was making 35 cents an hour, and I was supposed to get a raise, and he wouldn't give me a raise for some reason or other. So I took off and went to Wichita, Kansas, and went to work for Culver Aircraft. Culver Aircraft was a plane that made plywood planes as well, and these planes were called a PQ-8, which is a target plane that was used for artillery practice. In other words, if you flew one of these planes that, as small as they were at 4,000, that would simulate some height as much as 14,000, so they used them for artillery practice. These are one of the first planes that were totally flown automatically. The planes could be taken off and landed without a pilot aboard. It's quite an experience, and I worked there for several months up until October the 12th, 1942. Prior to that, I got married, and I was married for a spell, and we had a son. And going home one weekend from Tulsa to Wichita, a tire blew out on the car, and this little boy, baby boy, was in the back seat in the bassinet, and he fell out, and the car rolled over him, and he was killed instantly. That changed my life. I was very unsettled. A few weeks thereafter, I decided I wanted to go into Air Force. So I enlisted in the Army Air Force and was transferred to Midland, Texas, at the Bombardier Training School in Midland. And while I was there, orders were issued for me to get out of boot camp and go into immediate training to become a control tower operator. So I was there for several months, and then thereafter, Army had an ASTP program called Army Specialized Training Program, of which they were training people to go to Europe to help reconstruct Europe. I joined the ASTP program and at Lake Charles, Louisiana, John Manish Junior College in Lake Charles, Louisiana. My engineering skills on geometry and algebra and other aspects of engineering was not my cup of tea. I realized that, so I went down to the local base there in Lake Charles, near Lake Charles, and talked to the line superintendent if he couldn't get me back as a control tower operator. And surprisingly, he said, I'll talk to the lieutenant, and they got orders cut, and I got back as a control tower operator. the next move, I had nothing to do with it. Orders were sent down for me to be moved to Napier Field in Dothan, Alabama. And I was stationed there. Dothan, Alabama was a special base for advanced training planes. The first jets that were flown out of Dothan as a base for advanced training pilots. The base in Midland, Texas, of which I had been in, was a bombardier and navigator training school where the pilots were trained for that. But I stayed in the Air Force until after the war was over. I was mustered out January the 3rd in 1946. So that gave me 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days of service. So I left that and had opportunities to go in a different type of marketing, but I wanted to get into heavy industrial type marketing rather than the normal retail marketing that I was accustomed to doing. And so I went to work for a company called Black Civils and Bryson. This company specialized in building stock tanks and heater treaters and other type of equipment to produce oil and gas. They produced anything that was needed from the wellhead to the pipeline. And I was in that industry for a number of years. I was stationed there. I started out in Lindsay, Oklahoma, and in '46, and then in 1947 I got married to Joanne Shelton there, and we immediately moved to moved to Midland, Texas, as a area sales representative there in Midland, and I was involved in that for that type of business for about 13 years. I went with another company briefly, but most of my time was spent in that oil and gas business. We had a downturn in the oil business, and I could recognize that the opportunity that for me as a person was not there. So I had become acquainted with a banker there in where we lived in Texas at the time, and there was a startup company called Heart of Texas Mining, and they produced oil well frac sand at a plant down in Brady, Texas, about 200 miles from Fort Worth, Dallas. I was hired on as sales, and later they made me vice president and general manager of that company, and we grew that company to being one of the largest producers of frac sand. Along the way, while we were building that, we would accumulate a large amount of waste material called sand that was unusable for fracking. So I developed a contract with a company that needed a product called silica flour, and we would take the waste material and then we had engineered and installed ball mills to grind up the fine sand and make silica flour. This flour was used in pipe manufacturing. At that time, it was permissible to make pipe out of concrete and asbestos fiber. It was called transite pipe, widely used worldwide, even though it was very dangerous to work with asbestos fiber. It was done. So we had a contract with them for a period of years, which enabled us to build a grinding plant. Thereafter, this same company, which was a very large national firm, invited us to build a plant in California. They were building a new plant there. So I went to California and acquired property out there, and we built a similar grinding plant in California, at Riverside, California. And we got our raw material from a plant called Oro Grande Granite north of Riverside, and we had a very long contract on that. And I worked at that in that business there for 9 years, and along the way we were acquired by firm that had gone public, and they wanted us to find different business interests and to promote and build that company up. So I traveled extensively looking for minerals in New Mexico, Old Mexico, silver properties in West Texas, looked for sand down in Old Mexico. So I had an opportunity to look at a lot of different type of businesses and to see if we could promote those products, of which, as a result of that, we started selling some of our silicon flour that we were making there in Brady, Texas, to a plant in Monterrey, Mexico. During the course of trying to expand the plant, we encountered one opportunity that didn't fit the profile of the owners of the company that I worked for, was called Texas Oil and Gas. So after about a year or two, the plant that we looked at in Oklahoma was a company that produced dolomite, which is a double carbonate material used in glass making. It just didn't fit the return that was necessary for them to make the kind of investment. So I put together a small investment group. There was 4 of us, and then we invited some investors to come in with us, another 4 people, and raised the capital to buy this operation in Oklahoma that had been shut down due to labor problems. And so we went up there, and this plant specialized in dolomite. Dolomite adds a chemical to glass that keeps it from changing color. It's called blooming in glass, and glass making is called blooming. You've seen old Coke bottles or old bottles that have turned color. That's because it's short of magnesium in the glass. But every windshield, every architectural piece of glass you see today has dolomite in it. Dolomite is a double carbonate, has magnesium in it, and also has calcium. So it's widely used worldwide in glass making. I was president of the company for a period of about 8 or 9 years. It came along at the end of my tenure there that the man that helped me raise the capital, we had agreed that we would share in the profits of it on an equal basis. If he raised the capital and I would do that. After about 8 or 9 years, he started taking out a lot more for his services than we had agreed upon, and so we agreed that either I'd buy him out or he'd buy me out. So we had a buyer-sell agreement, and so we sold. My family wanted me to sell out rather than to buy the company. I had raised enough capital, I had saved enough, I had raised enough capital that I could have bought his interest out and become the primary shareholder in it. But I must tell you some events that happened that really caused my family not to want me to stay on. We had some unfortunate events there. Very difficult time for our company. Our plant manager borrowed our grader one weekend and went up to use the grader on his ranch not far from our plant. Coming back, he came across the railroad and got himself killed. And that was very unfortunate. We went to our insurance people, and they said, well, your policy, of all the exclusions they had on it, that if any accident occurred on a railroad easement, their policy wouldn't cover. Can you imagine that happening? And that's what happened. So they wouldn't represent us. They wouldn't go to our negotiations. So we finally wound up with a law firm in Oklahoma City that was very versatile in understanding rail law. And we figured it out that if we went to by this time, the widow of the gentleman who got killed had sued the company for $300,000 or $400,000, and obviously we didn't have that kind of funds, and we had no insurance coverage. So, nevertheless, we got with this law firm out of Oklahoma City, and they led us through a pathway of joining up with the widow to sue our insurance company in order to get her coverage. And lo and behold, we went to the federal judge, and he agreed that she was entitled to her funds, that we could join her in the lawsuit. So we sued our insurance company, and they paid her off and paid our insurance legal fees as well. So you can see it was a very difficult time during that. And then not long after that, we had one of our long-term employees who was out on one of the rail cars loading it, and in this instance, he had to lower the chute down in order to let it get in the rail car. Well, this gentleman who had done this for years did not raise the chute, started by gravity, letting the rail car move down the line to be loaded, and he was trapped between that and caused his death. So we had a lot of trauma, and it was probably the right time for me to move on. And so I sold my interest in that company, which was called Delta Mining, and started the company that I'm still now involved in, called McCabe Minerals. We're celebrating our 43rd year of operations. It was started by one of my former employees and myself. It was originally known as the McCabe Woody Company, and my partner was a very dear Christian friend of mine. He and I worked well together, and until his death, we were very close friends. He wanted to get out of the business about 25 years ago and go on mission field with he and his wife. And so he put the price on what he wanted for the stock. We had it evaluated. So I bought his interest out and became the sole owner of the McCabe Woody Company. In about 2 or 3 years, I decided that I put all the effort into it, and my family was currently involved in it, that we changed the name from McCabe Woody Company to the McCabe Minerals Company. And shortly thereafter, Woody left the company. My son, Vern, who had been with our company as vice president of sales, moved in and became actually the general manager of the company. He and his staff and his wife Rosemary have been actually running the business now for about 20 years or so, and I'm still around. I bring to the company certain talents that we still use. We still develop properties for frac sand, and also for glass making and foundries, and we're still active in that area of interest. And I get up every day asking the Lord, well, what's going to be new for me today? So that's where I am, okay?